The neon sign of the Gilded Cage, a private social club tucked away behind a nondescript brick facade on Passyunk Avenue, buzzed with an irritating rhythmic flicker that seemed to mimic the erratic heartbeat of South Philadelphia itself. Inside, the air was thick enough to choke on, a noxious cocktail of stale cigarette smoke, expensive cologne, and the greasy, lingering scent of fried calamari that clung to the heavy velvet curtains. For Clara Rossi, the 26-year-old woman wiping down the mahogany tables in the back, this atmosphere was a suffocating second skin, a reminder of her invisibility in a world built on appearances. She moved with a labored heaviness, her plain uniform straining against a body that the made men of the Russo crime family openly mocked, calling her the baker's dozen, or simply Big Clara, when they thought she couldn't hear, though in this acoustic trap of a room, she heard every cruel syllable. It was a Friday night, the busiest time for the organization, and the back room was reserved for the high-ranking capos and, most importantly, for Dante Russo, the Don's only son and the heir apparent to an empire built on loan sharking and union racketeering. Clara kept her head down, scrubbing a stubborn wine stain from the wood, trying to dissolve into the background as she always did, acting as a piece of furniture that occasionally breathed. The men ignored her presence with a practiced arrogance, discussing shipments from the Jersey ports and payoffs to local zoning commissioners, their voices low and gravelly, punctuated by the clinking of crystal tumblers filled with amber scotch. She was nothing to them, a shadow with mass, a creature of burden who cleared their ashtrays and vanished before anyone had to make eye contact with the girl who didn't fit the aesthetic of their glamorous, dangerous lives. Dante sat at the head of the table, looking bored and impossibly sharp in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Clara made in 5 years, his fingers idly toying with a gold lighter as he listened to a dispute between 2 of his father's lieutenants. He was handsome in a predatory way, with the sort of cold, detached eyes that had seen too much violence for a man of 28, yet tonight he seemed distracted, his gaze drifting toward the heavy steel door that led to the alleyway. Clara sensed the tension in him, a vibrating wire of anxiety that didn't match the jovial, loud demeanor of the older men surrounding him, but she dismissed it as the paranoia that naturally accompanied a life where every handshake could be a prelude to a funeral. She moved to collect a stack of dirty plates near his elbow, her heart hammering against her ribs as one of the soldiers, a brute named Paulie, sneered and made a crude gesture about her weight, causing a ripple of laughter to move through the room like a foul draught. Dante didn't laugh, but he didn't defend her either. In this world, kindness to the help was seen as a weakness, a crack in the armor that a rival could exploit, so he merely sipped his drink and looked away. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a familiar burn of humiliation that she swallowed down with the bile in her throat, turning her back to return to the kitchen, desperate to escape the oppressive gaze of men who viewed her as a grotesque joke. The kitchen doors swung shut behind her, muffling the laughter, but the silence of the prep area offered no comfort, only the solitary reflection of her tired face in the stainless steel fridge, a face she had learned to hate because it seemed to invite nothing but scorn from the people she was forced to serve. She busied herself organizing the silverware, the metallic clatter soothing her frazzled nerves, until a sudden unnatural noise from the main room froze her blood, a sound not of laughter or glasses, but of a heavy metallic thud, followed by the distinct, terrifying rack of a slide action. The kitchen door swung open just a crack, and through the sliver of light, Clara saw the nightmare unfolding. The steel door to the alley had been breached, the lock blown out, and 3 men in dark coats and ski masks were storming into the private lounge with suppressed submachine guns raised. The Russo soldiers, drunk and complacent in their own stronghold, were slow to react, their hands fumbling for pistols tucked into waistbands that were too tight, their reflexes dulled by the false security of their reputation. Time seemed to warp and stretch, slowing down to an agonizing crawl as Clara watched the lead gunman lock his sights not on the soldiers, but directly on Dante Russo, who was frozen in his chair, the gold lighter slipping from his fingers in slow motion. The assassin's intent was clear, cold, and professional. This wasn't a robbery. It was a decapitation strike intended to end the Russo bloodline right there on the plush Persian rug. Clara's mind went blank, stripping away the fear, the humiliation, and the years of ingrained invisibility, leaving only a raw primal instinct that screamed that she could not watch another human being be slaughtered. She didn't think about the physics of the bullet or the fragility of her own body. She simply propelled herself through the swinging doors with a speed that belied her size, a linebacker's charge fueled by pure adrenaline. The room was a tableau of impending death, the gunman's finger tightening on the trigger, Dante's eyes widening in the realization of his own mortality, and the soldiers still midway through drawing their weapons. Clara hit Dante with the force of a freight train, slamming into his side and knocking him out of the chair, just as the suppressed weapon coughed its deadly rhythm, spitting fire into the space where the heir's heart had been a fraction of a second before. She felt the impact before she heard the sound, a searing, white-hot sledgehammer blow to her upper back that punched the air from her lungs and sent her sprawling over Dante's expensive suit. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs, the world spinning into a chaotic blur of shouting, gunfire, and the shattering of mirrors as the Russo soldiers finally returned fire, filling the room with a deafening cacophony of violence. Clara couldn't breathe, the pain radiating from her shoulder blade like a spiderweb of fire, her vision narrowing to a tunnel as the smell of cordite and copper filled her nose, drowning out the scent of scotch and cologne. Dante was beneath her, stunned, his face splattered with specks of blood that were not his own, his eyes locked onto hers with a mixture of horror and absolute confusion. He tried to push her off, shouting something she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears, but then he saw the dark spreading stain on her uniform, the way her body went limp and heavy against him, a human shield that had absorbed the metal meant to end his dynasty. The gunmen, realizing their primary target was obscured and the room was now a kill zone of returning fire, began to retreat, laying down suppressive fire that chewed up the mahogany bar and sent shards of wood flying like shrapnel. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the noise, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the frantic shouting of orders. Dante scrambled out from under Clara, his hands shaking, his pristine suit ruined, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look at his men or check his own body for wounds. He knelt beside the woman everyone called the baker's dozen, his hands hovering over the wound on her back, his face pale as a sheet as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The room froze, the hardened killers of the Russo family lowering their guns, staring in disbelief at the scene on the floor, the Prince of Philadelphia, alive only because the cleaning girl they had mocked an hour ago had thrown herself into the path of an executioner's bullet. No one spoke. The insults, the laughter, the hierarchy of the mob, it all evaporated in the face of an act of loyalty so profound and suicidal that it defied their understanding of the world. Clara's eyes fluttered, her vision dimming, the pain receding into a cold numbness, and the last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Dante Russo screaming for a doctor, his voice cracking with a desperation that commanded the entire room to obey. The waiting room of Methodist Hospital in South Philly had been effectively commandeered by the Russo crime family, turning the sterile, fluorescent-lit space into a fortress of leather jackets and grim faces. Doctors and nurses moved with terrified efficiency, sensing that the men pacing the hallways were not the type to fill out insurance forms or wait patiently for updates on triage protocols. Outside, the rain lashed against the asphalt, washing away the blood on the sidewalk, but inside the atmosphere was electric with a suppressed violence, a coiled spring waiting to snap, depending on the news that came from the operating theater. Dante Russo sat alone on a plastic chair, his blood-stained shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his head in his hands, refusing to leave or get cleaned up until he knew the fate of the woman who was currently undergoing emergency surgery to remove a 9mm slug from her lung. Don Vincenzo, the Hammer, Russo, arrived 20 minutes later, flanked by his consiglieres, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the corridor as he marched toward his son with a face carved from granite. He was a man who believed in order, in the strict stratification of their society, and the report he had received, that his son was alive because the cleaning lady took a bullet, sounded like fiction, a glitch in the matrix of his understanding. He stopped in front of Dante, looking down at the blood on his son's hands, the blood of a civilian, a nobody, and for a moment, the terrifying silence between father and son spoke volumes about the precarious nature of power. "Tell me it's true," Vincenzo rumbled, his voice low and dangerous, ignoring the lieutenants who hovered nervously nearby. "Tell me a girl who scrubs toilets did what 3 of my best soldiers were too slow to do." Dante looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hard, stripped of the boyish arrogance that usually defined him, replaced by the haunted look of a man who had brushed shoulders with death and owed his life to a ghost. "She didn't hesitate, Pop," Dante said, his voice steady but quiet. "Paulie was still reaching for his piece. Tony was ducking. She just moved. She covered me." The admission hung in the air, a damning indictment of the men who were paid to protect him, and a bizarre elevation of the woman they had all disregarded. Vincenzo turned his gaze to the soldiers standing guard by the elevators, his eyes narrowing in disgust, causing seasoned killers to shift their weight and look at the floor, ashamed of their failure, ashamed that their honor had been saved by someone they considered beneath them. The surgery took 4 hours, a marathon of tension where the hospital became the center of the Philadelphia underworld, with scouts posted on the roof and in the parking garage to ensure the rival gang didn't come back to finish the job. Inside the operating room, the surgeons worked on Clara Rossi's damaged body, unaware that the patient on the table had just become the most protected person in the state of Pennsylvania, her life now tethered to the honor of the Russo family. Every suture, every beep of the monitor was a weight on the scale of debt, a debt that the Mafia took more seriously than any bank loan or government bond. If she died, it would be a tragedy, but if she lived, it would be a complication, a disruption of the social order that required a response no one had a playbook for. When the lead surgeon finally emerged, pulling off his mask with weary hands, the corridor went deathly silent, 20 men holding their breath in unison. "She's stable," the doctor announced, his voice trembling slightly under the collective gaze of the mob. "The bullet missed the spine by millimeters. It collapsed a lung and shattered the scapula, but she's strong. She's going to make it." A collective exhale swept through the room, but it wasn't just relief, it was the settling of a new reality. Dante stood up, nodding once to the doctor, a silent promise that the hospital would be well compensated, before turning to his father. Vincenzo nodded slowly, processing the information, calculating the political ramifications of the night's events, realizing that the narrative of the Russo family had just been rewritten by an outsider. "She is no longer to be touched," Vincenzo announced to the room, his voice carrying the weight of a papal decree. "No jokes, no disrespect. Anyone who looks at her wrong answers to me. She bled for this family. That makes her family." The declaration was absolute, a rewriting of the laws that governed their lives, transforming Clara from a target of ridicule into a protected asset, an untouchable figure sanctified by blood. But beneath the relief, the machinery of war was already grinding into motion. The attempt on Dante's life was a declaration of war, and the Russos needed to know who had pulled the trigger. In the hospital basement, far away from the sterile recovery rooms, 2 captured lookouts from the attack were being interviewed by the family's enforcers, their screams muffled by the heavy insulation of the boiler room. The information extracted was fragmentary, but pointing towards a disturbing alliance. The Irish gangs from West Philly, possibly backed by a traitor within the Italian factions, someone who knew the layout of the gilded cage and the schedule of the Heir. As dawn broke over Philadelphia, casting a grey, sickly light over the city, Clara was moved to a private recovery suite, guarded by 2 armed men who stood outside her door like statues. Inside the room, Dante sat by the window, watching the rain turn to mist, wrestling with a guilt that felt foreign to his nature. He had spent his life being told he was special, a prince worthy of sacrifice, but looking at the unconscious woman in the bed, hooked up to tubes and monitors, he felt like a fraud. She had saved him, not because of who he was, but because of who she was, a bravery he wasn't sure he possessed. The nurse came in to check Clara's vitals, moving around Dante with nervous reverence, adjusting the IV drip that kept the pain at bay. Dante watched the rise and fall of Clara's chest, the rhythm of a life he now owed, and realized that the dynamic of his existence had shifted irrevocably. He couldn't pay her off. Money was insulting after blood. He couldn't ignore her. That would be a sin against the code. He had to elevate her, bring her into the fold, but doing so would expose her to the very dangers she had just saved him from. The pressures of the underworld were closing in. The other families would hear of this. They would smell blood in the water, sensing weakness in a family that had to be saved by a cleaning lady. The narrative had to be controlled, spun into a tale of loyalty rather than incompetence, or the Russos would lose their grip on the city. Vincenzo entered the room quietly, standing beside his son, both men looking at the sleeping woman who had unwittingly become the centerpiece of a gang war. "When she wakes up," Vincenzo said softly, "your life belongs to her, Dante. Remember that. You don't own yourself anymore." Dante nodded, accepting the burden, knowing that his father was right. The debt of life was the only debt that could never be fully repaid, only serviced through eternal loyalty. He looked at Clara's face, pale and bruised, stripped of the anonymity she had worn like armor, and saw her for the first time as a person, formidable and terrifyingly real. The city was waking up. The sirens were wailing in the distance, and the war for Philadelphia was just beginning, with an unlikely heroine at its epicenter. 3 days after the shooting, Clara woke up to a world that smelled of antiseptic and expensive lilies, her body a landscape of dull, throbbing pain that spiked sharply whenever she tried to move. Her first conscious thought was confusion. Why was she in a private room that looked more like a hotel suite than a hospital? And why was there a man in a suit standing by the door with a bulge under his jacket? Memory flooded back in a violent rush. The gun, the leap, the fire in her back, the face of Dante Russo inches from hers. Panic surged, but before she could try to sit up, Dante himself stepped into her line of sight, looking tired, unshaven, but alive. "Easy," he said, his voice lacking the imperious edge she was used to, replaced by a quiet, intense solicitude that unsettled her more than his shouting ever had. "You're at Methodist. You've been out for 72 hours. You took a bullet for me, Clara." He said her name as if tasting it for the first time, giving it a weight and respect it had never carried in the club. She stared at him, her throat dry, unable to reconcile the man who used to ignore her, with this solicitous figure pouring her a glass of water with his own hands. "Why?" she croaked, her voice raspy from disuse. "Why are you here?" "Because you saved my life," Dante replied simply, placing the glass in her hand and helping her guide it to her lips, a gesture of intimacy that broke every social rule of their world. "And because outside this room, Philadelphia is burning. My father has gone to the mattresses. We're finding the people who did this and we're burning them out, root and stem." He didn't mention that the men guarding her door were there because there were rumors of a second hit, that the enemy knew she had survived and might be a witness to identify the shooters. The violence in the city had indeed escalated. The Russo family had unleashed a wave of retaliation that was turning South Philly into a war zone. 2 Irish pubs in Fishtown had been firebombed the previous night, and a known associate of the Sullivan gang had been found hanging from the Walt Whitman Bridge, a gruesome message sent to anyone challenging the Italian control. The police were swarming, sirens wailing day and night, but the code of silence held firm. No one was talking, and the streets were emptying out as civilians sensed the coming storm. Clara's recovery room became a command center of sorts. Dante refused to leave her side for long, using the adjacent sitting area to meet with his capos, speaking in hushed, furious tones about territories and retribution. Clara, feigning sleep, listened to every word, her mind racing as she absorbed the details of a world she had only ever seen from the periphery. She learned that the shooters were mercenaries hired by the O'Malley clan, but they had inside help. Someone in the Russo organization had disabled the alarm on the back door of the Gilded Cage. The realization that a traitor was close terrified her. If they could get to Dante in his own club, they could get to him here, and by extension to her. She watched Dante's back as he argued with a lieutenant named Sal, seeing the stress etched into his posture, the way his hands balled into fists. She was no longer just an observer. She was a participant, her fate inextricably tied to the winner of this bloody contest. The fat girl was gone. In her place was a witness, a savior, and a liability all rolled into one. On the 5th day, the violence reached the hospital's perimeter. A car bomb detonated 3 blocks away, targeting a Russo convoy heading to visit the Don. The explosion shook the windows of Clara's room, setting off car alarms and sending a plume of black smoke into the grey sky. Dante was on his feet instantly, drawing a pistol from a shoulder holster she hadn't noticed, his body shielding hers from the glass, his eyes scanning the street below with the practiced intensity of a soldier. "We have to move you," he said, holstering the weapon as he turned to her, his face grim. "This place isn't safe anymore. They know we're vulnerable here." "We're taking you to the safe house in the Poconos." Clara felt a surge of fear. Leaving the hospital meant leaving the public eye, disappearing completely into the Russo's dark world with no guarantee of return. "I just want to go home," she whispered, knowing even as she said it that her small apartment in South Philly was no longer an option, that her old life was dead. "You don't have a home anymore, Clara," Dante said, his voice harsh but honest, gripping her uninjured shoulder. "Not until this is over. You're a target now. If they can't get to me, they'll get to you to send a message. You come with us, or you die. Those are the choices." It was a brutal ultimatum, delivered with the cold pragmatism of the Mafia, and Clara realized she was trapped in the cage she had once cleaned. The transfer was executed at midnight, a military-style operation involving 3 decoy ambulances and a heavily armored SUV. Clara was wheeled out the service elevator, draped in heavy blankets, surrounded by men with assault rifles hidden under trench coats. The pain in her chest was a constant throb, but the adrenaline of the escape sharpened her senses. She saw the fear in the eyes of the young soldiers, the way they scanned the shadows, terrified of the unseen enemy. As the convoy sped onto I-95, leaving the city lights behind for the darkness of the highway, Clara looked at Dante sitting beside her, checking the magazine of his gun. He caught her gaze, and for a second, the mask slipped, revealing a boy terrified of losing everything. "I won't let them touch you again," he promised, a vow that felt heavy with the weight of the graves he was digging. Clara nodded, realizing that in saving him, she had damned herself to his war. The safe house was a fortress disguised as a hunting lodge, isolated in the deep woods, surrounded by high fences and motion sensors. As they arrived, the reality of her isolation hit her. She was a prisoner of her own heroism, locked away with wolves to protect her from lions. The escalation had only just begun, and she was no longer sure who was more dangerous, the men trying to kill them or the family sworn to protect her. The safe house in the Poconos was a claustrophobic luxury, a sprawling log cabin filled with taxidermy heads of deer and bears that seemed to watch Clara with dead glass eyes. For 2 weeks, she existed in a limbo of healing and high-stakes tension, her world reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin and the perimeter of the snow-dusted forest that the guards patrolled incessantly. Dante was there most days, coordinating the war from a secure satellite phone in the study, but the isolation was fraying everyone's nerves. The soldiers were restless, cleaning their weapons obsessively, smoking on the porch, and casting side glances at Clara that were no longer mocking but filled with a confusing mix of curiosity and suspicion. Clara's physical wounds were knitting together. The stitches itched, and her breath still hitched with pain if she laughed or coughed, but the psychological toll was mounting. She was trapped with men who killed for a living, eating meals prepared by an enforcer named Rocco, who knew 12 ways to strangle a man, but couldn't boil pasta correctly. She began to assert herself in small ways, taking over the kitchen despite her injury, cooking proper meals with the limited supplies, a simple act that shifted the dynamic in the house. The men stopped seeing her as a fragile artifact and started seeing her as a provider. The smell of garlic and roasting meat softened the edges of their aggression, and for brief moments, the safe house felt like a dysfunctional family dinner. But the war outside was going badly. Dante received news that the O'Malley gang had struck a major blow, hitting one of the Russo's money laundering fronts and seizing a shipment of narcotics. The traitor within the organization was feeding them real-time intelligence, and paranoia in the cabin spiked to dangerous levels. Dante paced the living room like a caged tiger, questioning the loyalty of his own men, his eyes darting to the guards, wondering which one might be selling them out. Clara watched him unravel, seeing the cracks in the prince persona, realizing that he was drowning in the expectations of his father and the cunning of his enemies. One evening, a fierce storm knocked out the power, plunging the cabin into darkness and cutting the phone lines. The backup generator kicked in with a roar, but the temporary blackout triggered a panic. Guns were drawn, and the guards took up positions at the windows, expecting a breach. In the flickering light of the emergency lamps, Dante found Clara in the kitchen, clutching a knife she had been using to chop vegetables. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice tight. If the power was cut, they might be here. They waited for hours in the oppressive silence, the wind howling like a banshee outside, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a footstep. Clara sat on the floor, her back against the cabinets, listening to Dante's breathing. He sat opposite her, gun in hand. and in the quiet he began to talk, not as a boss but as a man. He confessed his fear that he wasn't strong enough to lead, that he had always relied on his father's reputation, and that her act of saving him had shamed him as much as it had humbled him. "I should have seen it coming," he whispered. "I was too busy being the big shot to watch the door. You saw what I didn't. That eats at me." Clara looked at him, seeing the boy beneath the suit. "You can't see everything, Dante," she said, her voice steady in the dark. "But you have to see what's right in front of you now. Someone in this house is nervous. I've seen it." She told him about one of the guards, a young man named Vinny, who had been making frequent trips to the edge of the property line to check the perimeter, but always returned looking pale and sweating, clutching his burner phone too tightly. Dante listened, his eyes narrowing, the strategic part of his brain taking over the emotional turmoil. Before Dante could act on the information, the breaking point arrived. The front door exploded inward, not from a breach charge, but from a battering ram wielded by men in tactical gear. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. The O'Malleys had found them. Gunfire erupted in the confined space of the living room, deafening and chaotic. Dante flipped the kitchen table for cover, dragging Clara behind it as bullets chewed up the cabinets where she had been cooking minutes ago. "Vinny!" Dante screamed, realizing the betrayal was real. The young guard was nowhere to be seen in the firefight. He had likely opened the perimeter gate. The Russo soldiers fought back with desperate ferocity, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. Clara pressed herself into the floor, the smell of sawdust and gunpowder choking her, feeling the vibrations of the battle in her teeth. She saw a shotgun sliding across the floor, dropped by a fallen guard, landing just out of reach. Dante was pinned down, firing blindly over the table, his ammo running low. An attacker flanked them, moving toward the kitchen entrance, raising a weapon to finish the job. Clara didn't think. The same instinct that had moved her in the club took over. She scrambled forward, ignoring the pain in her healing lung, grabbed the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her bruised shoulder, screaming in agony, but the buckshot found its mark, sending the attacker flying back into the hallway. Dante stared at her, eyes wide, shock momentarily replacing his combat focus. She pumped the action, ejecting the shell, her face a mask of grim determination. "Reload!" she screamed at him, snapping him out of his trance. She wasn't the shield anymore. She was a combatant. The dynamic shattered completely in that moment. She wasn't the fat girl, she wasn't the victim, she was the partner in the foxhole. They fought their way to the back exit, stepping over bodies, the cabin burning around them as a stray bullet hit a propane tank. They burst out into the cold night air, the snow biting at their skin, sprinting toward the garage where the SUV was parked. Vinny stood by the vehicle, keys in hand, looking terrified, caught between his betrayal and his fear. Dante didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and fired once, dropping the traitor in the snow. They piled into the SUV, Dante behind the wheel, Clara in the passenger seat clutching the shotgun. As they tore down the driveway, leaving the burning safe house behind, Clara looked at her hands, shaking and covered in soot. She had killed a man. The line had been crossed. There was no going back to wiping tables. She had broken through the terror and found a cold, hard place inside herself she didn't know existed. She looked at Dante, and he looked back, not with gratitude this time, but with a dark, acknowledging respect. They were in this together, all the way to the bitter end. The escape from the Poconos was a blurred nightmare of icy roads and paranoia. They ditched the SUV in a strip mall parking lot in Scranton and stole a nondescript sedan, driving south on back roads to avoid the highways the O'Malleys would be watching. Dante was bleeding from a graze on his arm, and Clara's shoulder felt like it was on fire. The adrenaline crash leaving her trembling and nauseous. They were ghosts now, cut off from the family, unsure who to trust, with the realization that the organization was compromised from the top down. They holed up in a cheap flea-bag motel on the outskirts of Allentown, a place that smelled of mildew and despair, a far cry from the velvet curtains of the Gilded Cage. This was the bottom. No money, no backup, no status. Just two people in a room with peeling wallpaper, cleaning weapons and tending to wounds with gas station supplies. Dante paced the small room, his phone stripped of its battery to avoid tracking. He looked diminished, stripped of the armor of his wealth. "If Vinny turned," he muttered, pouring rubbing alcohol on his arm with a hiss of pain, "then they got to the capos. Maybe even Sal. My father, if they got to him." He couldn't finish the sentence. The idea that the Don could be compromised or killed was the end of his world. Clara sat on the edge of the sagging bed, watching the neon sign outside flicker. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. She had taken a life. The image of the man in the kitchen, the way his body crumpled, played on a loop in her mind. She felt a profound sense of loss, not for the man, but for her own soul. She was no longer innocent. She was part of the machinery of death she used to sweep up after. "We need to know who is left," she said, her voice hollow. "We can't fight a war if we don't know who the army is." Dante stopped pacing and looked at her. He saw the change in her, the hardening of her eyes. She wasn't asking for permission, she was strategizing. "There's an old associate," Dante said slowly. "A bookie in North Philly, old school, hates the O'Malleys. He might have ears on the street, but it's risky." Clara stood up, wincing but steady. "Staying here is death. Waiting is death. We move." It was she who pushed him now, her survival instinct overriding his hesitation. They drove back into Philadelphia under the cover of darkness, the city feeling like a beast waiting to swallow them. The meeting with the bookie, a withered old man named Mickey, took place in the back of a dry cleaning shop. Mickey looked at Dante with pity, and at Clara with fear. The word was out about the angel of death who saved the heir and blasted a hitman. "Your father is alive," Mickey rasped, "but he's under siege at the estate. The O'Malleys have the police commissioner in their pocket. They're squeezing the Russos out, the traitor. It's not Sal, it's your Uncle Leo." The revelation hit Dante like a physical blow. Leo was his father's brother, the man who taught him to shoot, to drive. The betrayal was absolute, a biblical severance of blood ties. Dante sank onto a pile of laundry bags, devastated. "Leo," he whispered, "he wants the throne. He made a deal with the Irish to wipe us out." Dante looked defeated, a man whose foundation had crumbled. He looked ready to give up, to run. Clara stepped forward, grabbing Dante by the lapels of his jacket, forcing him to look at her. "Look at me," she hissed, her face inches from his. "I was a nobody. I was the fat girl you made fun of. I took a bullet. I killed a man. I lost everything for your family. You do not get to give up now. You do not get to let Leo win. You are the Don now, whether your father is alive or not. Act like it." Her fury was palpable, a fire that burned away his despair. She was the strength he didn't have, the spine he needed. Dante stared at her, shocked by her ferocity, and then slowly the steel returned to his eyes. He nodded, a sharp, jerky movement. "You're right," he said. "We take it back. Tonight." He turned to Mickey. "I need weapons, and I need you to get a message to the few men we know are loyal. Tell them to meet us at the shipyards. Tell them the cleaning lady is calling the shots." Mickey's eyes widened, but he nodded. The legend was growing. They left the shop, armed and resolved, but the weight of the coming night was immense. Clara felt a deep, aching sadness beneath her anger. She knew that even if they won, she would never be normal again. She was bound to Dante, bound to this violence. She looked at her reflection in the car window, a woman transformed by trauma, formidable and scarred. She wasn't sure she liked who she saw, but she knew that person was necessary to survive the night. As they drove toward the docks, the rain began to fall again, washing the streets of Philadelphia. The FBI was closing in on the edges of the conflict, sensing the climax, but they were too slow. This was a matter of family, of blood for blood. Clara checked the shotgun in her lap. She was terrified, but she was done hiding. The bottom had been reached, and the only way out was through the fire. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was a graveyard of rust and steel, a sprawling labyrinth of dry docks and decaying cranes that loomed like skeletal giants in the misty night. This was neutral ground, or so it was supposed to be, but tonight it was the stage for the final act. Dante had called for a sit-down with Uncle Leo, a desperate gamble under the guise of surrender. The message sent was simple. Dante was done, he wanted out, and he would trade the family territories for safe passage and Clara's life. It was a lie, of course, a trap baited with his own apparent weakness. They arrived early, positioning the handful of loyal soldiers Mickey had rounded up, 5 men, grim-faced veterans who remembered the old codes, in the shadows of a decommissioned cargo ship. Clara was not hidden away this time. She stood right beside Dante in the center of the open concrete expanse, under the yellow glare of a single sodium floodlight. She wore a heavy trench coat to hide the shotgun, her face pale but composed. She was the variable Leo wouldn't account for, the weakness he would underestimate. At midnight, the convoy of black SUVs arrived, tires crunching on the wet gravel. Uncle Leo stepped out, flanked by the O'Malley brothers and a dozen heavily armed enforcers. Leo looked regal, dressed in a camel hair coat, a look of triumphant pity on his face as he approached his nephew. He saw Dante, disheveled and bandaged, and Clara standing slightly behind him, looking small and defeated. "Dante!" Leo spread his arms, a Judas smile on his lips. "It didn't have to end like this. You were just too soft for the crown. And you," he sneered at Clara, "the mascot. You should have stayed in the kitchen." Dante looked at his uncle, his face a mask of calm. "I trusted you, Leo. Pop trusted you." Leo laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal hulls. "Vincenzo is old. The world is changing. We need partners, not outdated honor. The O'Malleys offer progress. You offer sentiment." He motioned to his men. "Sign the papers, Dante. Then you can leave. The girl stays, though. She killed one of ours. Debts must be paid." This was the signal. Dante didn't sign. He dropped to one knee, not in submission, but to give Clara a clear line of fire. Clara whipped the shotgun from under her coat, the movement fluid and practiced now. She didn't aim for the body. She aimed for the engine block of the lead SUV behind them, pulling the trigger. The blast was deafening, rupturing the radiator and sending a cloud of steam hissing into the air, creating instant chaos. "Now!" Dante screamed, rolling to cover behind a concrete barrier as the loyal soldiers opened fire from the shadows. The shipyard erupted into a cacophony of automatic gunfire. Leo's men, caught in the open and blinded by the steam and the sudden ambush, scrambled for cover. Clara pumped the shotgun, firing again, this time taking out an enforcer raising a weapon at Dante. She moved with him, covering his blind spots, a synchronized dance of death amidst the flying sparks and ricochets. She wasn't thinking. She was existing in a state of pure flow, the fear gone, replaced by a cold clarity. Leo, realizing the trap, tried to retreat to the remaining armored car, screaming orders. The O'Malley brothers were returning fire with military precision, pinning Dante and Clara down. "We can't get to him," Dante shouted over the roar of guns. "He's getting away." If Leo escaped, the war would drag on, and they would lose. Clara looked at the crane above them, its control booth dark but the ladder accessible. "Cover me!" she yelled, tossing the empty shotgun and drawing a pistol Dante had given her. She sprinted across the open ground, bullets kicking up dust around her boots. It was madness, a suicide run, but the enemy ignored her, focusing their fire on Dante. She scrambled up the rusted ladder, her injured shoulder screaming in protest, hauling herself up to the gantry. From this height she had a bird's-eye view of the battlefield. She saw Leo crouching behind a car door, reloading. She steadied her breathing, bracing her arm on the railing, channeling every ounce of focus she possessed. She wasn't a sniper, she wasn't a soldier, she was a cleaner, and she saw the mess down below and knew exactly how to clean it up. She aimed not at Leo but at the fuel drum stack near the O'Malley's position. She fired 3 times. The third shot sparked on the metal, igniting the fumes. The explosion was massive, a fireball that engulfed the Irish gang's flank and knocked Leo flat on his back, stunned. The blast turned the tide. Dante's men advanced, securing the perimeter. Dante walked out from cover, gun lowered, walking towards his uncle who was crawling in the dirt, coughing smoke. Clara watched from above, her chest heaving, looking down at the man she had saved and the man she had helped defeat. Dante stood over Leo, looking down with no pity, only exhaustion. 2 shots rang out. The betrayal was ended. Silence returned to the shipyard, broken only by the crackle of flames. Clara climbed down slowly, her legs shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was fading. She walked to where Dante stood. He turned to her, his face splattered with soot and blood. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took her hand, squeezing it hard. The survivors of the O'Malley crew were fleeing. The police sirens were finally close, wailing like mourners. They had won, but the cost was etched into their faces. The funeral for the fallen and for the public image of the old Russo family was held 3 weeks later under a slate-grey sky. It was a closed-casket affair for Uncle Leo, the official story being a tragic heart attack, a lie that everyone in attendance knew, but no one challenged. The hierarchy of Philadelphia had been violently rearranged. Don Vincenzo, frail and recovering from the siege at his estate, sat in a wheelchair by the graveside. but he was no longer the true power. All eyes were on Dante, standing tall in a black suit, and the woman standing directly to his right. Clara Rossi was unrecognizable from the girl who had wiped tables a month ago. She wore a tailored black coat, her hair styled sharply, her posture radiating a quiet, dangerous confidence. The scars on her back and shoulder were hidden, but the change in her eyes was visible to everyone. The capos, the soldiers, the rival associates who came to pay respects, they all nodded to her. Not with mockery, not with lust, but with fear and deference. She was the Iron Lady now, the one who walked through fire. The fat girl epithet had been erased from history. To utter it now was a death sentence. After the service, the inner circle gathered at a new location, a high-end restaurant in Center City that the family had acquired. The atmosphere was subdued, but stable. Dante sat at the head of the table, but he didn't start the meeting until Clara had taken the seat next to him, the seat traditionally reserved for the consigliere. There was no formal announcement, no ceremony. The placement of the chair said everything. She was the advisor, the gatekeeper, the one who had proven loyalty beyond blood. Dante poured 2 glasses of wine, sliding one to her. "The O'Malleys are suing for peace," he said quietly, the room listening intently. "They want to cede the waterfront operations in exchange for a ceasefire." He looked at Clara. "What do we do?" It was the ultimate validation. He wasn't telling her, he was asking her. Clara took a sip of the wine, tasting the complexity of it, looking around the room at the men who used to ignore her. She saw Paulie, the one who used to make fat jokes, staring at his hands, terrified to meet her gaze. "We take the waterfront," Clara said, her voice cool and level. "But we don't give them peace, we give them probation. If they step 1 foot south of Market Street, we finish what we started at the shipyard." The table murmured in agreement. Her word was law because it was backed by the reality of violence she had survived. Later that night, Clara stood on the balcony of the restaurant, looking out over the city lights of Philadelphia. Dante joined her, lighting a cigarette, the smoke drifting into the cold air. "You know you can never leave, right?" he asked softly. "You saved me, and in doing so, you sentenced yourself to this life. There is no walking away." Clara looked at the city that had once rejected her. She thought of her small apartment, her lonely nights, the invisibility that had been her prison. Then she looked at Dante, the man who now viewed her as his equal, his savior. She had traded innocence for power, anonymity for respect. It was a high price, a bloody price, and she knew the guilt would haunt her in the quiet hours of the night. But she also knew she would never be mocked again. She would never be invisible again. "I know," Clara replied, turning to face him, her silhouette framed by the city glow. "I'm not going anywhere, Dante. Someone has to watch your back." Dante smiled, a genuine, weary smile. "La Cosa Nostra fell silent for you, Clara. Remember that." She nodded, turning back to the view. The sirens wailed in the distance, a familiar song of the city. She was part of the music now, a conductor of the chaos. The girl who cleaned the tables was dead. Long live the woman who ruled the room. The story of the fat girl was over. The legend of the godmother had begun.